Good morning from St Paul's Cathedral in London, where later this morning the funeral service for Lady Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, British Prime Minister from 1979 until 1990, will take place. There have been a considerable number of people here outside St Paul's. I was just talking to somebody who arrived here at 3:30 this morning to watch the ceremonial that will take place, and it's not a particularly nice day. It's cold and there's been a bit of drizzle, but we hope the rain will hold off for the processions. It must be said that not since the death of Winston Churchill nearly 50 years ago has the death of a politician been marked on such a scale. It's not quite a state funeral, but nevertheless a very grand affair, with full military honours. Lady Thatcher's coffin will be borne on a gun carriage drawn by 6 black horses of the King's Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery, and that happens just before the entrance to the City of London. And then they come up to the cathedral here at St Paul's. The streets on the route lined on either side by representatives of the armed forces who fought in the Falklands. Inside St Paul's, where members of the congregation are already arriving, the doors opened at 9 o'clock. Apart from Lady Thatcher's immediate family, there'll be a host of people representing bits of her life. There'll be politicians from all political parties. There'll be many visitors or representatives for countries from abroad, from the United States, from South Africa, the former President F.W. de Klerk. There'll be a number of famous faces, and then of course there'll be her friends and the people who looked after her in recent years. And also coming to the first politician's funeral since she came to Winston Churchill's funeral, Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. There's a very strong police presence here today. Policemen everywhere you look in this part of London. Of course, they are no doubt expecting some protests, as old adversaries have made their views felt, both in Parliament and in the country at large, since Lady Thatcher's death. The battles of the 1980s have been refought. And inevitably questions have been asked about why Lady Thatcher should have been awarded a funeral on this scale, when most of her predecessors were buried with modest ceremony. In Whitehall here, there aren't any crowds at the moment, but there's a reason for that, because the journey of the coffin from Westminster to the point at St Clement Danes, where it's transferred to a gun carriage, is simply by a funeral hearse, so there's not that much for people to see. Nevertheless, the police are very heavily lining each side there. We'll see whether crowds come out. Of course, the justification that's given for this scale of funeral is that Margaret Thatcher was the towering politician of her generation. The words actually of Ed Miliband, the Labour leader. She wasn't only Britain's first woman Prime Minister, she was the first Prime Minister since everyone had the vote to be elected 3 times running. And she saw many changes. As we know, her reforms were bold, painful sometimes, often very bitterly resisted. Controversial in life she was, and still controversial today in death. Lady Thatcher's coffin lay overnight in the chapel of St Mary's Undercroft, down there at the Palace of Westminster, where of course she fought so many of her political battles. And in just under an hour from now, it'll be brought from there by this hearse along the bottom of Parliament Square into Whitehall, and will pass Downing Street, number 10, there past the Treasury, and those gates which Margaret Thatcher had installed here because of the constant threat from IRA terrorism. No one will forget her courage when the bomb exploded at the Grand Hotel in Brighton. It was after that these gates were put up for security reasons. And then she goes past the Ministry of Defence on the other side of Whitehall, where the Falklands War, or conflict as it's officially called, was run. And then up to Trafalgar Square, turns right under the observant gaze of Admiral Nelson, and so into the Strand, past Charing Cross, until she arrives at the Royal Air Force Church of St Clement Danes. And here her coffin's going to be transferred to the gun carriage and accompanied by a band, and the wonderful sound of muffled drums, will move at a slow walk down Fleet Street to Ludgate Circus, up Ludgate Hill to the steps at the west front of St Paul's Cathedral. Now we have two reporters with us this morning watching events out there in the streets. Michelle Hussain is going to be at St Clement Danes, and Sophie Rayworth is at the Palace of Westminster.
Well, it is incredibly quiet here at Westminster at the moment, eerily so. In fact, just a handful of people waiting by the barriers for the moment when Baroness Thatcher's coffin leaves here for the last time at 10 o'clock this morning. The hearse carrying Baroness Thatcher's body arrived here just yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock, the coffin draped in a Union flag. It was a low-key arrival for the woman who dominated Parliament for so many years. Her body was carried down some steps into the chapel of St Mary Undercroft, a small, Gothic, beautiful chapel that dates back to the 14th century. And there her coffin rested overnight. Beloved mother, always in our hearts. The message from her children, her twins, Mark and Carol Thatcher, who came here yesterday afternoon for a short service in the chapel led by the Dean of Westminster. It was attended by around 100 MPs, peers and staff from Parliament and Downing Street. And then until 9 o'clock last night, the chapel remained open so that more MPs and peers as well as parliamentary staff could come and pay their last respects. Well, it was Margaret Thatcher's wish that she should spend her last night here before her funeral at the Palace of Westminster, as close to the House of Commons as she could be. And at 10 o'clock this morning, she will leave here for the last time. She will be driven in the hearse to the Strand, and that's where my colleague Michelle Hussain is now.
St Clement Danes is the church of the Royal Air Force, but today it has a unique role to play because it is here that the undertakers will hand over to the armed forces and the coffin will continue its journey as part of a ceremonial procession. When it arrives here, it'll be received by two chaplains, the Reverend David Osborne, who is the chaplain of St Clement Danes, and the RAF's chaplain-in-chief, the Venerable Ray Pentland. It'll be placed on stands that are already waiting in the nave, and both chaplains will say prayers during the brief time that the coffin is here inside the church. It is after those prayers that the bearer party will approach. This is a group of 10 men who have been chosen from across the armed services and who together represent regiments, units and ships that all served in the Falklands. Among them the Scots Guards, the Royal Marines, the Fleet Air Arm and the RAF. And leading that bearer party will be two brothers who are Falklands veterans, Major Nicholas Mott of the Welsh Guards, Garrison Sergeant Major William Mott. In 1982 they were both on board the Sir Galahad when it was attacked by Argentine forces and suffered terrible losses. Today, they will be part of that bearer party that will carry the coffin out here to the gun carriage that will by then be waiting. And then, once the coffin is placed upon it, they will walk alongside the gun carriage all the way to St Paul's Cathedral.
Michelle, thanks very much indeed. Well, the doors of the cathedral behind me opened 9 o'clock exactly. There was a queue already of people waiting with umbrellas up because the rain had just started. And people inside are looking for their seats. Many of the more prominent guests are placed, others are fighting to get a seat where they can properly see and hear. And during this time the organ will start playing from now until the beginning of the service. All the music chosen by Lady Thatcher, all apart from one piece by Charles Stanford, who was Irish, by English composers. And indeed there is an Englishness about this service that you will recognise as it takes place. Now, under the great dome designed by Sir Christopher Wren, 365 feet high, is the place where Lady Thatcher's coffin will rest. And just near there, two small thrones for the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. And then beside them, the Prime Minister, former Prime Ministers, members of the Cabinet, members of the Armed Forces, the Knights of the Garter, many foreign representatives from nearly 200 countries, including American Secretaries of State, George Shultz, James Baker, Henry Kissinger's coming. We did think that Hillary Clinton might be here, but we gather she's not. And then, of course, Lady Thatcher's family and some very close friends, and people who looked after her. Her two grandchildren, Amanda and Michael, are going to be in the procession carrying her Order of Merit and her Order of the Garter. And her granddaughter is going to read one of the lessons. The other, read by the Prime Minister. Lady Thatcher had said whoever was Prime Minister at the time, she would like it read by him, or I suppose her. There will be beautifully sung music from the choir of St. Paul's. There'll be bold and stirring hymns for the congregation to join in. The Bishop of London will give an address. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, will give the blessing, his first state occasion since his appointment. And the coffin will then be taken back from here to the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, before going on to the crematorium, and her ashes will be buried tomorrow in Chelsea, near the ashes of her husband, Sir Denis. And just before we leave the cathedral for a moment, I should just say, if you don't want to watch the procession to St. Paul's and all the other events unfolding, but just want to see what's going on inside the cathedral without commentary, you can do so by pushing the red button and we'll say goodbye to you. But for everybody else, here we are in the studio in front of St. Paul's, and I have with me three guests: Shirley Williams, former leader of the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords, former Labour minister,
Yes.
Peter Hennessy, professor of contemporary history and for many years a political journalist, and Sir Terry Wogan. Lovely to see you here, Terry. So let us start with you. What brings you here?
Well, I represent the hobbledehoy element that have been invited.
The hobbledehoy Irish element.
Well, no, not necessarily Irish, but just, you know, the players, I'm afraid. I'm representing those, and privileged to be here, of course.
Seriously, what brings you here? What is it? What was it about Lady Thatcher that
well, I can't claim that I knew her intimately, but I did interview her when a long-lost television show called Wogan. She came on and conducted herself with great propriety, and in fact, afterwards in the hospitality suite, which we used to call hostility, she brought Denis with her, and Denis was downing the pink gins, as was his wont, and he'd had at least 3 or 4, and it was keeping a weather eye on him, and she said, Denis, that's 2 you've had. We must be off. So, you know, that's how I knew her, and she invited us when I was president of the Lord's Taverners charity for handicapped children.
She was good at that, wasn't she? She came to a charity that I was president of, and out of the blue I'd asked her again and again if she was free, and one day suddenly Bernard Ingham rang up and said, "Oh, she'll come." And she made a terrific speech, you know, and stayed an hour and talked about
I'll not forget her for turning up for children in need, the only Prime Minister to do so.
Shirley, this business of her husband, Sir Denis, was very, very close to her. But let's just look at her as a woman politician. I mean, you're a woman politician, you know what it's like in the House of Commons and indeed in the House of Lords. What was it about her that was so striking?
Well, 2 things really. The first was that her domestic life was a very precious, separate thing. And I remember that on at least 3 occasions when I met and talked to Margaret, she was ironing at the same time. She was very keen on ironing. It was somehow something about the tidiness and sort of correctness of her life. And I think Denis Thatcher was crucial to that. But in a funny way, I also think he wasn't particularly interested in her politics and her policies. He was particularly interested in her. He loved to watch her act in the political world.
Yeah, when she told him she was standing for leader, he said, "Of what?"
He said of what? I think I started that story,
yes.
And it's a true story.
True story, is it?
True story.
I think he must have been teasing her.
Well, I'm not sure entirely. I think he actually kept a certain detachment. He kept himself as her husband. And she always regarded him that way. She was very proud of making him breakfast quite often, as well as ironing the shirts.
What about in the House of Commons?
Well, then take the other
why
side
are we
of it.
here, I suppose,
Right.
is the real question.
First of all, because of the extraordinary single-mindedness of her personality. And what really zoomed her from Grantham to number 10 was this extraordinary commitment of the whole of her energy and thought to how she was, where she was getting, and how she was going to get there. And that went through the whole of her political life, staggeringly much more than I think any other Prime Minister. And secondly, something that hasn't been talked about a lot, which is that Margaret Thatcher saw politics as being extremely serious. It wasn't the subject of cartoons, it wasn't the subject of jokes, it was something that was of central significance, and therefore, unlike many male politicians who she regarded as playing games, she never played games with politics. She was always central and serious.
It wasn't politics for gossip. Peter, there hasn't been a funeral on this scale since Winston Churchill.
Since 1965.
Yes, and before that, you have to go to Gladstone and Palmerston.
Wellington.
And Wellington.
Wellington. They're reserved for the titanic figures in British politics, and wherever you stand on Mrs. Thatcher and her policies, Margaret Thatcher and her policies, you have to recognise this extraordinary force field she had around her. And she had from the very beginning. She was a primary colours politician who spoke in caveat-free sentences. And Shirley and I were talking about her earlier, that no pastel shades, said Shirley. There were no pastel shades. And I was with Shirley. I was very lucky as a young journalist in the first weeks of '75, when Shirley was a minister, and the private secretary was going to bring in the news of who'd won the last runoff ballot, Willie Whitelaw or Margaret Thatcher, to lead the Conservative Party. And I remember Shirley saying to me, before the result came in, as a woman, I hope it will be Margaret. But as a Labour politician, I hope it will be Willie, because if it is Margaret, she will polarise politics and she'll push my party to the left, and Willie Whitelaw won't. And Shirley was spot on, and that's partly the big story of the 1980s. A primary colours politician who disturbed all the atoms in the normal force field of British politics.
Well, we'll talk more about it during the morning. Let's just have a reminder, though, about Lady Thatcher's career. I mean, political careers are always uncertain. Politicians, as Shirley Williams knows well enough, are buffeted by fate. And with hindsight, these careers may seem to have a kind of inevitability about them, but for those who chance their luck on a political career, every step may be the one that trips them up. Margaret Thatcher's rise through the Tory ranks to become Prime Minister was no exception. She had the luck, but she also, as Peter was saying, had the determination and nerve needed to get to the top in a man's world, where no woman, remember, had ever ventured before. The incoming Thatcher government tried to curb inflation, increasing tax and interest rates. The economy went into recession, unemployment rose, and with it trade union opposition to her policies. Undaunted by her unpopularity, she pressed on.
I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Thatcher's response to the Argentine invasion of the Falklands 8,000 miles away was decisive but risky. After a victorious 74-day campaign, Mrs. Thatcher celebrated the triumph.
Margaret Thatcher returns to Downing Street with the biggest majority since 1945.
Her second term of office was marked by violence at home. Violence on the miners' picket lines as they struck against pit closures. Violence in Brighton when the IRA tried to kill her.
Life must go on as usual.
Thatcher pressed on with plans to hand back power from the state.
We Conservatives are returning power to the people. That is the way to one nation, one people.
On the world stage, she made common cause with President Reagan.
We share so many of the same goals and a determination to achieve them. You ain't seen nothing yet.
But Gorbachev's Russia, too, was sympathetic to her message.
It is wonderful to be entrusted with the government of this country, this great country, once again.
But her third term in office proved her downfall. An attempt to introduce a universal local tax, the poll tax, led to riots in the streets. And just as damaging was dissent in cabinet over her new stridency on Europe. It led to the resignation of her Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, and a challenge to her leadership from Michael Heseltine. When she failed to win an outright majority of Tory MPs, her own cabinet told her it was time to go.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.
One of the curious things about political life is it's those cliches that we see again and again, the picture of Lady Thatcher leaving Downing Street or the ladies not for turning, that in the public mind, in our minds, seems to define the politician. In fact, of course, political life isn't like that. As somebody was writing about her the other day, she worked and worked and worked with an attention, focus on detail. And those public appearances were just things that were dressed up either for her party conference or for a speech. And it wasn't the real Lady Thatcher. We're joined now by Michael Forsyth, Lord Forsyth, who was a very junior minister, I think, in her government. But then you got to know her in later years, and when she was in the House of Lords. What was your impression of her strength?
Well, actually, I first got to know her with Keith Joseph and was involved in her leadership campaign. In fact, I think I won £50 on a 50p stake on her becoming leader of the Conservative Party.
£50
yeah,
and 50p?
I think it was something like that.
Not
It was a lot for a student. I mean, I got involved because the country then seemed a complete disaster, and she had this optimism and this belief in Britain, and the belief that it could be turned around at a time when most people didn't. And as a minister, of course, you had to work very hard. I mean, David Davis, I remember him shouting to me as I was rushing across the central lobby, Rome wasn't built in a day. And I said, well, Margaret wasn't in charge of that job. And she expected people to work as hard as she did, and that was quite a standard.
Is it a good and essential characteristic? Because a lot of senior politicians, a lot of prime ministers aren't like that. I mean, everything you hear about her was focus on this, focus on that, focus on that. Why have you done this? Have you done that? Whereas you often get a much more relaxed style, don't you, Peter, of a sort of, I mean, the way Macmillan handled
Harold
the Conservative Party was completely different.
Almost took it to caricature. He was almost prostrate with languor as Prime Minister.
Reading a trollop in the afternoon.
He said, I'm up with a lark and I go to bed with a trollop. That's what he used to say. But he always felt with Margaret Thatcher that the clock was ticking. It wasn't just that I might not make it through the next election, I might just be a one-term Prime Minister, but even when she was in her pomp in the mid-1980s, as an outside observer of her premiership and her style of government, you felt that the clock was ticking. And she said to a friend of mine in Number 10, in July '79, and he said very kindly to her, you've had a very busy year, an exhausting election, I think you need a holiday. But she said, I must govern. And she felt right to the very last day, didn't she, Michael? This compulsion to govern.
I think she was driven by this thing that she got from her father and her Methodism, that if you had talents, you had to use them, you had to work hard for the benefit of society and the country as a whole.
Was it a disadvantage in some ways? I mean, was it that, for instance, that led her to her downfall with the poll tax and her party turning against her, because she sort of couldn't see the wood for the trees?
Well, I don't know that today's a day to talk about the politics of it. I don't think it was her downfall at all. People think she was very dogmatic, but every meeting on every issue started with one question, which is, what are the facts? She had a belief, a set of beliefs and convictions, but she was prepared to change according to the arguments, and I think her scientific training made her very determined to operate on the basis of facts. And yes. I think modern government, I think it's very difficult for ministers if they're not on top of the detail.
Do you agree with that, Shirley?
Yes, she was a much more pragmatic politician than people think. She gets called an ideologue. I don't think she was an ideologue. She was a person with very strong convictions, but it's interesting to me that she never, for example, tried to privatise the National Health Service. She never turned back comprehensive schools. And one of the reasons for that was because she deeply believed that what had been embedded in the wishes and opinions of the British people were not for Prime Ministers just to stand on their heads. She was much more pragmatic and much more in tune, I think, with popular opinion than most people have recognised.
I think the other thing about her is she was always keen, even in her latter years where she was suffering from her illness, she always wanted to get things absolutely right and not let people down. And so, as her memory deteriorated, she found it very, very difficult and quite frightening, actually, going to public engagements, because there was always this worry that she might say the wrong thing. But her sense of duty and being involved in charities and so on drove her on.
Let's just go back inside the cathedral, where it's been open now for 40 minutes or so, and there are various figures coming up the aisle. Now, we know that there are going to be senior politicians, her cabinet here, and many old friends. Betty Boothroyd there, the former Speaker of the House of Commons. I think Michael Martin, another Speaker, is going to be there too. The present Speaker will be here as well, George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, arriving, and his wife. Inside there, on the left, Cecil Parkinson. Leon Britton on the right, both in her cabinet. Ken Clarke coming up the stairs. The only member of her government who is still in government in the cabinet. And they're going to the seats that are reserved. The closest part under the dome is where the VIPs, so to speak, are going. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Defence Secretary and Secretary of State for Scotland. Vince Cable, Business Secretary in the coalition government. Many Labour MPs have stayed away, but some have come here. It's not been entirely divided on partisan lines for the reasons we've been discussing. There are some Labour MPs who feel very strongly that they shouldn't come, that it would be hypocritical to come. But there are many others who acknowledge that there is a difference between the person and the politics, and that the politics can be set aside for a day like this. Well, all my guests here are going, apart from Peter Hennessy, who's going to stay here, are going into the... You're going, Matthew, into Matthew Paris, the former Tory MP, worked very closely with Mrs. Thatcher, and Virginia Bottomley, Lady Bottomley, Baroness Bottomley, I should call you, Baroness Bottomley, who also worked in Mrs. Thatcher's government. Virginia, I'll start with you. What was your memory of her today when you hear the eulogies and hear the Bishop of London and all that? What's the Mrs. Thatcher, or the Lady Thatcher, that you'll remember?
Well, she did carve out the way for women. I mean, there were 23 women when I went into the House of Commons. We never thought we'd have a woman Prime Minister, and she was just remarkable. I always think she invented political power dressing. I only got selected in my constituency because I had my hair done exactly like hers, and I wore a suit and a bow like hers. And whenever you saw her, she was sort of impressive, formidable, remarkable. So there was this extraordinary sort of confidence, which I think we've been talking about, came out of being a scientist and being out of a Methodist. She had this sort of clarity. You know, women are always supposed to be full of self-doubt and lacking in confidence. So she had this great vision. And she always knew what the big issue was. I mean, when she said Prague is the centre of Europe, you felt, she's right. You know, she brought in Eastern Europe. She recognised that. So she had this wonderful clarity of speech. But to me, I was always daunted by her, I'm afraid.
Frightened of her?
I'm afraid so.